Well, look, I'm delighted that my next guest is the very courageous Katherine Deves, the Liberal candidate for the seat of Warringah, a smarter, more relevant and more community-oriented candidate than the existing Teal member. I was most probably the first person to interview Katherine Deves on this simple issue, that as a society we can't ignore biological reality. Katherine is a lawyer, the co-founder and the spokeswoman for Save Women's Sport Australasia. It's non-partisan, non-religious, a grassroots organisation, part of an international coalition of women's organisations, athletes and supporters of women in sport, who assert simply that male athletes should not compete in the female sport category. This is not an attack on transgenderism or gender identity, but the organisation Save Women's Sport grew from policies in Australia and New Zealand which were prioritising the inclusion of males in female sport with a declared trans and or gender identity. Katherine Deves, since the day I interviewed her when no one had heard of her back in April last year, Katherine is simply arguing in defence of women's sex-based rights when sporting organisations, almost all of them, began endorsing guidelines that prioritised self-declared gender identity over biological sex for competition categories. Let me make it clear, I've always recognised the difficulty of people who feel they might be a man in a woman's body or a woman in a man's body. That's not the issue. It's entirely separate from saying that someone born a man should qualify to play in women's sport. Katherine is a mother of 3 little girls who participate in 7 sports, and I believe the overwhelming majority of Australians support Katherine Deves' views. They now have a chance to demonstrate that support by voting for her on Saturday in the seat of Warringah. This is a highly intelligent and courageous woman, and she joins me. Katherine, thank you for your time. Just in a preliminary sense, how have you handled these extraordinary attacks against you for making a fairly simple point?
Good evening, Alan. Thank you so much for having me on the show. I do need to clarify, I am the Liberal candidate for Warringah, and I've handed on Save Women's Sports Australasia to a group of very dedicated women who are carrying the torch there. But with respect to what's happened to me over the last few weeks, look, I've had a lot of support out there in the community through my volunteers, and you know, the position that I've held with sport, I think is common sense. I don't think it is controversial at all. A lot of people support me. The majority of people in Australia support me.
I've no doubt. How is it, just one other point on that, how is it in Australia that someone like you, who holds a simple opinion that biological males shouldn't play female sport, and yet, because you hold that view, you have to be followed during an election campaign by security detail? No one, Katherine, should be afraid to leave their home, surely.
I agree with you. It seems that if you stand up and say something that goes against the prevailing dogma of the time, which might be that biological sex exists, and that if we ignore it in the context of sport, it has ramifications for girls and women, it upsets people to the point that they will threaten your family.